January 1936. A man becomes king who never truly wanted to rule. Edward VIII stands before the world as the hope of the monarchy. Modern, charming, adored. To the newspapers, he is the Golden Prince, who finally brings fresh air into the palace. But behind the doors of Buckingham Palace, another man sees something entirely different. No savior, no modern king, a danger. Sir Alan Lascelles has known Edward for years. He has seen his restlessness, his aversion to paperwork, duty, and limits. And now that very man sits on the throne, a king who wants to be free, and a servant who knows that freedom can turn dangerous for a king. At court, they called him Tommy, the last great Victorian courtier. Severe, remote, brilliant, cold. A man who worked behind doors, behind letters, behind files, behind wordings that were often stronger than orders. But that picture is too simple. Lascelles was not only a servant of the crown, he was one of the men who decided where the crown ended and duty began. Was Alan Lascelles the savior of the monarchy, or its coldest instrument? Born in 1887 in Dorset, raised in an aristocratic world that prized rank, discipline, and restraint above feeling. His mother died early. He grew up the only surviving son. Lascelles learned early to observe rather than complain. He did not become a warm man, but a very precise one. School, Oxford, Latin and Greek. Then the war. On the Western Front, he saw what happens when men in high places make bad decisions. Perhaps the later courtier was formed right there, not in the palace, but in the mud of Flanders. For Lascelles never served people alone. He served a system, and that system was the monarchy. Not as a fairy tale, but as a construct of duty, rank, silence, and control. A king was allowed to be human, but not too much. To Lascelles, that limit was cruel, but necessary. He believed in rules, in distance, and in men hard enough to say no at the decisive moment. The first great break came with Edward, the Prince of Wales. To the public, he was the Golden Prince. Edward disliked reading papers. He slipped away from duty. He loved distraction, company, affairs, admiration. He wanted the crown as a stage, but not as a burden. Year after year, Lascelles tried to bring order to him. Appointments, letters, duties, discretion. Nothing held. And slowly, professional exhaustion turned into political fear. For this man was not just some difficult employer, he was the future king. Then Lascelles did something almost unthinkable for a courtier. He warned a prime minister about the heir to the throne. In Ottawa, he spoke to Stanley Baldwin about Edward's unfitness. Not politely, not cautiously, but with a hardness that showed how deep his worry already ran. He became a man who wanted to protect the crown from its own heir. For a courtier who judges the king crosses an invisible line. But Lascelles crossed it anyway. When Edward truly became king in 1936, the crisis Lascelles had long feared began. Wallis Simpson was no longer a quiet rumor. She became the question on which the monarchy could break. A king wanted to marry a divorced woman. The church objected. The government objected. The dominions objected. Edward saw it as his personal decision. Lascelles saw an institutional danger. To him, it was not about romance. It was about whether a king could place his own wish above duty. The answer of the political and religious order was clear: No, Lascelles was not the man who pushed Edward off the throne. But he understood early that this king had brought the crown into an impossible position. In the end, Edward chose against the throne, and Lascelles stayed. In the days that followed, Lascelles sat at table with Harold Nicholson. Master of every expression as a rule, here he showed open contempt. Edward, he said, had been given every gift but a soul. Suddenly, the monarchy no longer looked like a fairy tale of crowns and balconies. It looked like a system that could lose even a king. And yet, in the end, the servant stayed in the palace. The king left. Under George VI, his power grew quieter, but greater. The new king was dutiful, unsure, exhausted. Lascelles became his most important man in the background. And in the war, that work became more than administration. It became survival. When George VI and Churchill wanted to join the invasion fleet in June 1944, Lascelles did not see courage. He saw a constitutional problem. What happens if king and prime minister die at the same time? What happens to the young Elizabeth? Who leads the country then? He put the question to George VI so plainly that the king could not evade it. Soon after, Churchill gave way too. The king and his prime minister stayed behind. The man without office had stopped them. But Lascelles's hardness did not strike kings alone. Margaret felt it too. She loved Peter Townsend, a divorced man, older, charming, and dangerous not for what he did, but for what his marital history meant. Margaret was not just any young woman. She was the Queen's sister, and Elizabeth was not only her sister. She was Queen, head of the monarchy, and supreme governor of the Church of England. If Margaret married Townsend, it would not stay a private love story. Could Elizabeth show sympathy as a sister while she had to protect the order as queen? For Margaret, it was love. For Lascelles, it was a crack at the most sensitive point of the system. Not because he disliked her, but because he saw that here, family, church, government, and monarchy stood against each other. So they waited. Separated. Townsend went to Brussels. Margaret stayed behind. He did not make the decision. It lay in the law, in the church, in politics. He only carried it out. But he was the man who spoke it. And so he became the face of a hardness others had decided on. Here lies the price. Edward lost his throne. Margaret lost her hope. George VI lost the right simply to be brave in a historic moment. Every one of these losses was real, and every one was the price of someone holding the line no one else would hold. He believed in duty more than in comfort, in order more than in happiness, in the institution more than in the person before him. But the crown survived what it might not have survived without him. Later, his diaries were published, and suddenly the invisible power had a voice. In them, Lascelles appeared as no simple villain, nor as a hero. He was clever, snobbish, loyal, sharp, impatient, sometimes cruel. But he understood something many royals never did. The monarchy does not survive because people freely do as they please. It survives because someone, at the right moment, says, "This far, no further." And in exactly that lay his power. Alan Lascelles was not powerful, although he held no office. He was powerful precisely because he held no public office. He had no voters to convince, no headlines to win. he had to do only one thing: protect the crown from the people who wore it. In 1981, Sir Alan Lascelles died at Kensington Palace. The old courtier was 94 years old. The kings he had served were long since history. The princess he had hurt was still alive. The Queen reigned on, and somewhere in the British Constitution his shadow remained. Not as law, but as a limit.